You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back, everyone. We are glad to have you here. I have with me two very special guests. I know I say that whenever we have a guest on the podcast, but it is absolutely true here. I am nerding out a little bit. These are a couple of my favorite podcasters. We have Kyle and Randy here from the Pastor and Philosopher Walk into a Bar podcast. So Kyle, Randy, good to have you here with us tonight.
Good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I stumbled across their podcast totally on accident, actually. I want to say it might have been one of the ones where you were interviewing like Jared Bias or Pete Enns, because I listened to their podcast, or I don't know, maybe it was one of the like beer camp things that Tripp does. But I saw that, I'm like, just off of the name, I'm going, I have to look at this. And one episode in and I was hooked. So I binged whatever you had. It was probably around Thanksgiving of last year. Well, not last year now, 22. So around Thanksgiving of 22, I binged in like 3 months. Yeah. I do not want to even try to count how many podcasts I listen to in a week's time, but you guys are one of my favorites, coming from very different perspectives. Randy is the founding and lead pastor at Brew City Church in Milwaukee, and Kyle is a friend of his there that is a philosophy PhD. So they come at the topics from very different points of view, but incredibly civil conversation. I really think we need more of that, especially in the topics they talk about. So I am excited to have you guys on here because we have been going through Ecclesiastes recently in our podcast, and Ecclesiastes really dives down into both theology and philosophy, which are two areas that I am not great in. I am neither a theologian nor a philosopher. I am a Bible scholar. So I deal with like the ancient context of the Bible. And since we're talking so much about both theology and philosophy in this series, I wanted a couple guys who know their stuff when it comes to that. So glad to have you guys on here. And
just to be clear, Colin, neither of us are theologians.
Right. Yeah, it's fair, but we've at least got the.
That's why we talk to so many, because I'm bewildered by much of theology. Randy is encouraged by much of it, and his preaching is better for it. So we try to talk to as many as we can.
Fair enough. So let's talk about your podcast for a second here, because there are all different kinds of podcasts out there on both theology and philosophy, but not really theology and philosophy combined. So tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you decided to start the podcast, and why it intersects on theology and philosophy.
Yeah, so I've been going to Randy's church for quite a while, and we used to do these Q&A series after, let's say, you get to the end of a sermon series and there's a bunch of questions, and so you just have a day where you devote it to Q&A, and I would moderate a bunch of those, and so we kind of discovered a kind of chemistry in doing that together, just answering questions that people had, and also a lot of similar themes would crop up regardless of what the topic was supposed to be. You'd get the same questions over and over, and so somebody, I think, suggested we start a podcast, and we kind of giggled. And then over time, it just seemed like a better and better idea the more of those that we did, where we could just kind of take the kinds of conversations that we would have had anyway and have them in front of other people. And we had no idea if people would be into it or not, if we would do, 10 or 15 episodes and call it a day. But we're almost 100 episodes in. We're coming up on our 100th episode here pretty soon. And people seem to be jiving with a lot of what we're doing. So basically, I'll just answer for my part, and Randy can fill in whatever. You can't really do pastoring well without thinking carefully in what I would call philosophical ways about some significant theological questions. Yeah. And if you're a philosopher who happens to also be a Christian, I think you have a kind of obligation, a moral obligation, to consider the questions that you're studying in a way that is accessible to more than just another academic philosopher, especially when those things have significant theological and spiritual import. And it's really easy to miss some really important stuff if you're only talking to other academics. And so bringing in a pastoral lens is super important. A good example is we recently did a 2-part episode on the problem of evil. And I think you just totally miss maybe the most crucial aspect of that problem if you're only talking about it from a philosophical lens. So we are good correctives to each other, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think every pastor should either have a close friend who's a philosopher or take like a philosophy 101 class. Maybe you should offer that, Kyle. Philosophy for pastors, and basically just talk about epistemic humility the whole time, because there's a couple of things that I've learned from doing this with Kyle. We've been friends long before we did this, but now that we've had these extensive conversations about some really, deep and rich things, that theme of epistemic humility is something that is so lost on many, many pastors and church leaders. Everyone looks to as the expert on everything, and really we're the expert on very few things when it comes down to it. And the world's a better place when we're really honest and humble. Doing this podcast has helped me as a pastor, I would say, and it's been a lot of fun. I think I probably was the one who needed the most convincing. I was like, the world does not need more 30 or 40 something year old white dudes talking into the microphone. But enough people asked, and our producer said yes, and that's when I said yes.
Yeah, that made a huge difference.
When we got someone named Elliot to mix and make a sound delicious and to edit and all that stuff, then I said yes, because I'm very, very inept. Kyle can tell you stories about how terrible I am with technology.
Yeah, my wife Jana does our editing, and she makes me sound a lot better than I do unedited, so I totally understand that. So that is both the pastoral and philosophical side, but we can't leave out the last bit of the podcast, and that is walking into a bar. So let's talk alcohol for a second here. For starters, what you drinking right now? What we got?
Well, I'll go first. So you sent me a whiskey.
Yes.
So that's what I'm drinking, and I'm extremely grateful, and it's really interesting. So this is Heaven's Door straight rye. We'd had a couple Heaven's Door things on the show because we feature some kind of drink every episode, but I never had their rye, and I had no idea it was finished in cigar barrels.
Right.
French cigar barrels, and it's not like a special edition. It's just their standard straight rye that's finished in that way. So I've never had a rye like that, and you can tell it's really intriguing.
Yeah, so I came across this because of you guys. This is so dumb, but this is the way my brain works. So I spent like 20 minutes going back through all your episodes earlier today. I'm like, where did they try the Heaven's Door? I know it's on your site. It was back in like March, I think, of last year. And for whatever reason, when you talked about it, it sounded interesting to me because I had never even heard of the brand, owned by Bob Dylan, or at least participated in with him. So I'm like, I want to try that. And I went to one of our local liquor stores. I found a 3-pack that had the straight bourbon. I think it had like a double oaked one. And then it had this one. And this was like the first rye that I actually liked. It was like my introduction to it because it has everything you want in a rye, but I feel like it's then ratcheted up a few notches, and you really get like a kind of tobacco.
There is kind of a tobacco thing, It's hard to maybe just because it's there, and so you're looking for it. But
right,
cool,
yeah.
Colin, I actually quit drinking about 5 months ago. Yeah, so kind of screwed the pooch for the theme of the show a little bit. But just basically just made a choice after a long amount of thinking and trying to figure out how comfortable am I with my relationship with alcohol. Obviously, it's been a theme on this podcast, and we're going to do a show soon about why I quit and all that stuff. But basically just decided to be best for me my relationship with alcohol had gotten to the point where I just didn't want to mess around anymore. So I just quit. And September 11th was my last day drinking. This is February something. I don't know what today is. And it has nothing to do with 9/11. It's just that So anyways, I'm drinking a blackberry citrus sparkling water.
Wow, very nice. Good.
I think rye, there's a handful of really, really good ryes, but in general, I think rye is best for mixed drinks. Like I prefer Manhattan with rye over bourbon. I prefer an old fashioned with rye over bourbon. These are drinks that are like Wisconsin drinks. And I just think the spiciness, the lack of the sweetness that a bourbon brings to it is really nice for a high quality mixed drink. But then you get like the Whistle Pig 6-year or 10-year or what you guys are drinking. And then that shouldn't be near any mixers.
Right.
No.
I did put this in I think it was a Manhattan, and it worked.
It makes a really good Manhattan. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned whistle pig, because I set aside a little bit of that since I knew Kyle would be drinking that. But
Nice.
I actually have something unique here. I got a bottle over here I can show you. Whistle pig does a legend series where they match up with other groups. They did one with some baseball player. This one, they meshed with Formula F1 racing. I don't know if I can get that on there. It's blurring on my camera. But so there was the Alpha F1 team currently has a Chinese racer on there. And so they took their rye and they aged it, or they finished it in lychee and oolong.
Whoa.
What?
Yeah, it's insane. I found this, it was a limited release thing. You would never even know it's rye. It's so fruity,
Really?
so floral.
Yeah, that's weird.
It kind of tastes like mango popping bubbles. You get in like a boba tea.
Oh man, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say
Yeah.
they put it in a race car and drove around the track.
They did that too. No,
Did they?
seriously.
Yeah, of
Did you
course.
say Formula One?
Yeah, it was a Formula One thing. They put in like the wind tunnel that they use there to get it meshing with the barrel and everything. But yeah.
Hilarious.
Like the
So-
one there's a bunch like that now. Like one that they, the put it on the ship and took it across the ocean. There's
Yep,
one
Jefferson does
played
the HDC.
Metallica to it for a long time. One
Yep,
went up to
the
space.
blackened.
I don't know if you saw the space one. That was like $20,000 a bottle.
Yep. So just slightly out of my price range. But
So dumb. So dumb. That's when you know a fad has like run its course. When you're taking
Seriously.
shit to space.
So yeah, we have been going through Ecclesiastes, and that book really gives voice to both the intersection of theology and philosophy. Personally, I think more than any other book in the Bible. And there are 100 different ways you can approach it. If you have 5 commentaries, you've got like 8 different ways of looking at the book. But I think that's undeniable that it is a very unique perspective within the scriptural canon. And the main voice in it, Qoheleth, he questions the assumptions of other wisdom literature like Proverbs and Psalms. And he observes that sometimes living the godly, religious, churchy life doesn't always make life go better for you. So if we could time travel Qoheleth, get him here and sitting across from you at a bar, what would you say to him after hearing his discourse? Like, what do you make of someone who begins a conversation with vanity of vanities, all is vanity? Like, does that fit your worldview, or does it make you uncomfortable? What do you feel about his perspective?
I mean, I love Ecclesiastes. I don't believe in like divine sovereignty. Well, I don't believe in like a lot of people believe in it. I'll say that.
How so? Like, not a Calvinist way?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But in 2020, we did a sermon series on the book of Ecclesiastes, and right in the middle of the book of Ecclesiastes in our sermon series, COVID happened. And so literally we were in the middle of the book and we were all meeting on Zoom, and it was the perfect book to be working our way through and talking our way through as a global pandemic's happening and everything's nonsensical and everything's crazy and unprecedented and all the words that we used. It was perfect. So that word vanity, I mean, in Hebrew, it's hevel, and hevel is translated as vanity, and the King James and some of the others as meaningless in others, which I like as well. But my favorite is just the thought of hevel is vapor, all is vapor, and the idea of reality being like a vapor that you think you have a handle on, or thinking that you have a handle on God. We have an understanding of who God is and how God works in the universe. But all of a sudden you realize at a moment's notice, your world slips from underneath your feet and you feel like everything is vapor. Everything's kind of, I had a handle on everything and all of a sudden it just slipped through the cracks of my fingers and I don't know what happened. And I think it's amazing that Ecclesiastes is in the canon of scripture. I mean, it was one of the hottest debated books within scriptures of whether or not we should put that in there. And I understand it because it sounds heretical in many ways, but so do all of us when the crap of life hits. And I love Qoheleth's perspective. I think it's a little extreme, but I think I could have a better conversation with Qoheleth at a bar than I could with most of the writers of the scriptures, to be honest with you. I think I'd ask him what brought him to the place where he did that teaching, because I mean, it's framed by the narrator in the beginning and the end. But I think a lot of his observations of life are really real life stuff. I don't think I understood Ecclesiastes when I was younger. No offense to anyone who's younger, but when I was in my teens, 20s, 30s, I felt like I had life by the coattails. It was just perfect. I had everything that I wanted. I was heading in the right trajectory. And then just enough of life starts happening, and the sorrow and the grief of life catches up to you, and the disappointment of life catches up to you, and the meaninglessness, the vanity, the vapor of life that you feel like I've got a handle on things one day, and the next day I don't know what I'm doing. Pastorally, it's really helpful to have a book in the Bible like that, where it doesn't give you all the answers. It gives voice to the questions that almost all of us have, and at the same time, it's a little bit frustrating because of that, but I think that's a reflection of life. So I love Ecclesiastes. I would just want to know what was going on in Qoheleth's life if he was a real person, to be able to bring him to the point where he did that teaching.
Yeah. Kyle?
I would ask him what I should drink, because I get the sense that he would know. He would have really good recommendations.
Right, he's tried it all. He tried the $20,000 space whiskey.
Yeah. Because according to tradition, he was King Solomon, right? So if we're just pretending he's a real person, why not that person? So he could buy me whatever. No. So Randy's favorite interpretation of that word is vapor. Mine is absurd. And that's not because I know anything about biblical criticism or the Hebrew language. I don't. I just like it.
Yeah.
It makes sense of the book to me. I think they all fit. I think all of the standard interpretations fit. You can find some passage in there that seems like that must be what he meant. But I like absurd, and I'm getting that mostly from Michael Fox, I think, is the commentary I'm pulling from there. And, it's a little anachronistic to take, like, mid-20s, 20th to 21st century philosophy and stick that back on, an ancient text. And so I'm not saying this is good biblical exegesis. I'm saying it just makes a lot of philosophical sense to me to interpret that in a similar way that you would get in somebody like Camus, for example, where to say that something is absurd is to say that there isn't a meaning that is defensible, that anybody can hold up as like better than anybody else is suggesting for what a meaning might be. And that much of life, COVID pandemic is a great example, seems pointless and random. And not just that, but like almost like a cruel joke in some ways. And if not so black, would be humorous for how nonsensical it is. Many of us felt that way in the pandemic. I remember watching Tiger King and thinking, this is a perfect representation of what's going on in the world right now. And I think that show would make an excellent pairing with the book of Ecclesiastes. It's got everything, every human emotion. So I would ask him, give me an example, buddy. What happened in your life to get you to here? Explain to him a little bit of existentialist philosophy and see if he thought that was on the right track, or if he could, get on board with some of what those guys were saying. Like, another thing I would ask is, did you actually write that bit at the end, or did somebody else tack that on after you died to make it more palatable?
I would love to know.
I feel similarly about that as I do about the ending of Job. It like ruins the whole thing. If I had my way and was in those councils where they the canon,
see, this is what I love.
I would have axed that
if you're just listening, Randy's shaking his head right now.
It just seems. I mean, I get it. You can interpret it in many ways and make it make sense, but it seems a little jarring, the switch. So is that consistent with everything that came before? How did you get there?
So you guys both talked a little bit about COVID and all. Have either of you found yourself in a situation kind of similar to Qoheleth in your life, like a stage in life where you feel like the answers of everyone around you, including the church, just weren't enough? Maybe something like some of the older writers would call a dark night of the soul. Like, have you experienced that? If you're willing to share any of it, what was it like and what got you through it?
I went first last time, Kyle. Your turn.
I've definitely not experienced anything I would compare to what gets called the dark night of the soul. That I think that has a very specific historical meaning that we should probably be careful about applying it to other kinds of things. I've definitely experienced doubt, but doubt is like a normal thing for somebody in my profession. It's not something that seems weird. It's more weird if you don't have it, and it's a professional flaw. Like, we all know those of us in the guild who don't have it, and we look askance at those guys because they're not being honest. So yes, I've had doubt to the point of disbelief, for sure, about lots of things, but it oscillates, and it's always oscillated, and I've never experienced that as a break in my faith continuity. For me, doubt and faith have always just been one experience. From when I was a kid, I remember talking to my pastor of the church I grew up in about stuff that nobody else talked to him about. I'm sure I was really annoying little kid.
Did that fit the community, or did you feel outside because you had that?
Thankfully, it did. Yes, it would not have fit my later communities, but that happened to be just because it was near where we lived, and it's the denomination my mom grew up in. It happened to be a more liberal-ish denomination.
Gotcha.
Which, to say anything in rural Kentucky is liberal is like
it's on a spectrum.
liberal compared to, but he was fortunately very welcoming of my questions and attempted explanations, which I'm sure must have been a lot of fun to him. So yes, but that would not have been the case later, communities I was a part of. So I was lucky in that way. But no, I've never experienced what I would call a dark night of the soul or, real spiritual torment or anything like you read about in the mystics or something like that. So those bits of Ecclesiastes or other parts of the Bible, I don't really resonate that much with.
Yeah.
I'm more job with reflections on the limits of human ingenuity and wisdom. That's what draws me to Ecclesiastes.
I don't think most people can fully relate to what Qoheleth said. I think there's a reason that we only have a couple of passages like that and not 60 of the books. But how about you, Randy?
Similar to Kyle, I would not claim to have gone through a dark night of the soul. I won't be surprised when that comes along, and I would be very happy if I never do. Doubt is something that is like, I feel like it's a friend of mine now. I've been pastoring since I was 28 or 29, and I'm 45. So a lot of my formative years have come while pastoring and leading a church. And the way I counsel people and the way I'm with people is much different now than it was in the beginning. It's been a journey of just change and evolution and growth, I think, and probably in a lot of real life. One of the main facets of my job is to be present with people in crisis. That's something that just like, that's where life teaches you. And it's a lot like Qoheleth is talking about, where it's just like, I know I preach sermons on the goodness of God, but right now I don't know where it is. When you're holding a 25-month-old stillborn baby in your arms with a mom and dad who are broken, or when you're sitting with parents of a 4-year-old who just died of leukemia. These are not hypotheticals. And it feels like, not even in my 40s, I dread to think of what I'm going to say when I'm in my 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. But like, we just lost a friend who's a parent of one of our kids' friends from school yesterday to breast cancer. And then 2 weeks ago, we lost another friend to stomach cancer. And then last year, one of my good friends lost his wife, who was 46 years old. That stuff starts adding up enough to know that there are no easy answers. And there's no amount of God speak that you can lather on something, even though us pastors try our best to do it. And us Christians are really good at pretending and faking it till we make it, pretending that everything's okay, or that we give these trite platitudes about God being good all the time, when really life just doesn't make sense and sucks sometimes. And it doesn't stop, even when you want it to, for a long time sometimes. So I'm at that point where I forgot what the question was, but I've never explicitly gone through a moment like that. But yeah, I'll tell you, Qoheleth's perspective in the book of Ecclesiastes has been really helpful in learning how to be with people. This is something that isn't unique to pastors. I mean, I think all of us Christians would do well to sit in the book of Ecclesiastes, but also to learn how to be present with people without having to fix them, to be present with people's questions and doubts without having to answer them right away, or to even validate people in their questions and doubts, to know that when you're having questions and doubts, it means that you're at a moment where you're finally taking your faith seriously, I believe. If you've never encountered a season of questions or doubts about your faith, it makes me question how much your faith is integrated into real life, or how much real life you've experienced. Because eventually the hard questions are there. And it's not just Ecclesiastes, right? I mean, we have a really good example in the Psalms of a lot of the psalmists being really frustrated with this God who seems to make a lot of really great promises, and hearing a lot of stories about God delivering God's people over and over again. But God isn't anywhere right now. And I don't know why. And I'm really pissed about it, as a matter of fact. I think those are some of the things for us to really sit with and take that into whether it's pastoral ministry or just like being a good friend. Christians sometimes aren't very good at being good friends, and I think listening to Qoheleth would be very helpful sometimes.
Oh, I love that, because in the tradition that I grew up in, we kind of separated faith and real life. Like, the more godly you were, the less in real life you were living.
Yep.
Because real life is the spiritual life. And so all I heard were the platitudes, the trite sayings. And for almost 15 years now, I have struggled with depression and in various forms. The more that I would try to get these answers from Christians, reading the books, listening to the sermons, talking to faith leaders, the stuff that helped other people just drove me further away. And Ecclesiastes felt like a book that for me gave voice and validity to my darker moments. Like, I really resonate with some of the doubts and observations that he makes. So if I can kind of drill into what you were both talking about there for a minute, let's talk to the person who is going through the loss of a child or a wife, in midlife or anything like that. How do you respond to someone like that? And do we have to try to correct these things in light of the cross, or can we just let them sit and be in those moments? How would you take some of what Qoheleth is saying and apply it to those situations?
I mean, I don't recommend quoting Qoheleth to anyone in Christian. That's a little extreme, but I do think taking that perspective into a conversation, or helping inform, how do I navigate this with a friend or a loved one who is going through this incredibly excruciating time. I love Kyle's word absurdity. I mean, I think Qoheleth helps not make sense of, allows the absurdity and the complexity of life into our worldviews and into our reality, and bringing that in of just like, this can't be explained. There's not a verse in the Bible that is going to make everything better if I, quote it to my friend who lost their daughter, or my buddy who just yesterday lost his wife. The last thing that I'm going to do is quote a Bible verse to him. But I will do, I think, what Qoheleth would recommend, which is be present with them. And I think in some ways Ecclesiastes is a contemplative book in many ways, because over and over where Qoheleth comes down to is like, here's what you got. Enjoy today. Eat something delicious. Drink something tasty, sit with some people you love, because you're not guaranteed tomorrow. And that to me could be seen as a fatalistic, really dark, cynical way of living. But also, I think it just encourages us into a contemplative way of living. And we can do that with our friends who are grieving or going through loss or doubts or disillusionment or losing faith. The person who's losing faith, perhaps, let's just go there. They've probably encountered and searched out all the Bible verses that you have to offer them. The thing that they don't need is another Bible verse. The thing that they need is just someone to listen to them, someone to let them know, wherever you land on this, whether you're a Christian or not, at the end of this journey, I'm with you because I love you. Because that's the heart of Christ. Like, Qoheleth only goes so far in my book. Qoheleth asks some really good questions, brings some really good thoughts to the surface. But we find the fulfillment of all this stuff in Jesus. And I think we find a person who is really present with people in all their states in the person of Christ. But I think holding that hevel, that absurdity, that vanity, that meaninglessness, the vapor of life, that'll help us when we encounter, or our friends encounter, something that's just beyond our pay grade.
I like how you call it contemplative. Like, it's not something where we have to have an end goal of getting the person over the hump of feeling sad about it or grieving. Like, we don't have to push them through that. We can sit with them in the hurt and just be.
Being present, like, I'm trying to be present in every moment, right? Like, I want to live a contemplative life in that I'm present with you guys and not distracted by thinking about what time my kids are going to bed in a little while, or what I got to do tomorrow. I want to be present to this conversation. And just the same, I mean, people can feel it when you have an agenda with them, or when you kind of have these, pat answers that you looked up on Google so you can help your friend who's grieving, rather than just in love being present with and to them. That's a different way of navigating that altogether.
Very good. Kyle, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
that was more of a question for a pastor than
Sure.
a philosopher, I think. So I totally resonate with everything Randy just said and don't have too much to add. You don't really want a philosopher in the midst of your suffering any more than you want a Bible verse, right? Philosophy is really good preparing for suffering,
Yes.
and then reconstructing or trying to make sense of your suffering after. I would say it's probably even necessary to do both things well. In the throes of it, I'm not sure what it has to offer. There are probably philosophers out there who disagree with me. If anything, it might offer an unrelenting focus on the truth of things, like what do I actually know is the case here. And in my own experience of suffering, which has never been as deep as anything Randy just described, what I would receive as like the worst possible kind of counsel would be any kind of pretense, any kind of dishonesty. And when you're suffering, dishonesty is super clear. It's clearer probably than at any other time. We talked to a philosopher named Keith DeRose a little bit ago on our show. And he talked about how he hates funerals because of how dishonest they seem to him. Like when you're grieving and someone tells you they're in a better place, you know that's bullshit. And it's bullshit because they don't know it. It might be true. Okay, so it's not, that's not what I mean. I'm not saying it's false. I'm saying it's bullshit because, and I mean that in a technical philosophical sense. It's the sort of thing that neither of you knows. And so how can it possibly be comforting to me? Now, some people might experience it as comforting, but someone with the disposition of a philosopher is not the kind of person who would seek out philosophy before or after their period of suffering, is not going to find that comforting, most likely. So when Randy was talking earlier, in response to a different question, I had the thought that one of the main things that philosophy and pastoring well, and also theology have in common is forcing you to pay attention to something. Like, look at the world and call it what it is, describe it the way that it is, and then act on that basis. And don't look away from it. Suffering is pervasive, and if you're going to have a meaningful response to it, it's got to be honest. It's got to just call it what it is and not paper over it with something else. And
like stop pretending that doesn't exist just because you want to have a Christian perspective.
And there's deep, profound theology that takes that into account, that takes that as its starting point. And if you're really practiced in a sort of philosophically informed way of theological thinking, then you experience suffering in a different way. I think that's borne out in the history of philosophers who have suffered a great deal. Have had a lot to say about how to get through it.
Along those lines, in the book, Qoheleth does acknowledge God's presence, and he doesn't say a lot about following God or obeying God. There's a little bit about fearing God in there, but it seems like he's mostly just focused on enjoying life as much as you can. Coming from the independent fundamental background that I had, I often heard that you can't find any meaning or purpose or even morality outside of life believing in the Christian God. I think Qoheleth would challenge that belief in a way. One of the things I learned in the study is the name of God never shows up in the book. He's just called God in there. So what would you guys think of that? Like, can you be moral without God? Can you find meaning in a life without God?
I'm going to let Kyle rip that up first.
I thought it might go that way.
Yes, you can, in fact, be moral. Yeah, I used to hear that a lot too, back when I was into like apologetics and all that in college. It's interesting how seriously the defenders of Christian theology took that claim. Like they thought it was really important to be able to answer it effectively. And I just think I don't want to say it's silly because that's, condescending, but it's not the sort of thing that if I were to propose an objection like that, I would not expect to be met on serious terms by serious people. You just go out into the world and you talk to people who are different from you, and you can meet people who don't believe in God, who don't believe the things that you believe. It's very obviously possible. Not only is it possible to be moral and good and have a flourishing life apart from Christianity or Christian ethics, it's possible to ground those things in something non-Christian very effectively. And this is what bothered the Christian apologists so much. So their response that they loved was, yes, you can be moral. There's lots of moral atheists, but you can't justify your moral position without Christianity. And that also is silly. It's just historically naive and kind of uninformed about the history of really clever ethical thinking from non-Christians and non-theists. There's many, many ways to explain morality that have nothing to do with God. And the overwhelming majority opinion of professional ethicists recently, but going back a pretty good ways, is that not only do you not need God, God kind of overcomplicates things unnecessarily, and we should probably try to ground it differently. So yeah, my view is a hard yes, you can and you should be moral without God, and in fact, you should try to ground it outside of God too. Now, that's not to say that Christian theology has nothing to say to ethics. It has a great deal to say. And as a Christian, I have to try to incorporate those things. I have to try to make them make sense together and take what I think are external justifications for a moral life and combine that somehow with the teachings of Jesus in a way that's consistent. And that's kind of a hard project.
Yeah. I'm sorry. If anyone is watching this right now, my camera went out on me and it doesn't want to come back on. So I can't quite figure that out right now. But we will continue just going with the audio while I try to troubleshoot here. But Randy, you have anything to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I wanted Kyle to answer first, because we need a good philosopher to answer questions like that. But I think it's just, can I be at all political on here, Colin? Or
yeah, that's fine.
Will you lose half your audience or something?
No, you're fine. If it ends up being too much, we can edit. But no,
please do. Please do if you think this won't be productive. But I think there's a really good case study on, can you be moral? Are morals dependent on the Bible or on the Christian God or whatever? It turns out that right now we have like 80-something% of evangelical Christians who are wholeheartedly, in most cases, voting for, supporting, willing to overthrow the government for the most immoral politician that we've had in, maybe ever, at least in the, in the last 100 years. And I find it ironic. I've had multiple conversations with people who aren't Christians, but are asking Christians that are present with me in the moment, how do you support Donald Trump? And you get all sorts of excuses, or you talk about the Supreme Court or, Roe v. Wade, whatever. But it's telling when the non-Christians are asking the Christians, how do you support such an immoral person? So I think that's just an example of actually people who claim to follow Jesus can get their morals all twisted when it's convenient for them, or when it's on their side ideologically, or when you've conflated your political ideology with your theology and your spirituality. So I think, Christians should have some humility to think, are my morals a reflection of the person of Christ in the Beatitudes, or are they more a reflection of the political party that my church told me to support? And I think this idea of, where Qoheleth says, hey, just here's the deal, just enjoy today. Enjoy the beer you're going to have, enjoy the ice water with lemon that I'm drinking these days, like you're being with people and grill out and just enjoy that. To melt that down and say there's no God in that is a form of silliness. It's like, if we believe that God is somehow behind all that exists, and that God actually created humanity in God's image, then that means something about all of creation, all that exists. And if the Spirit of God is at work and present at all times with all human beings in all parts of the world, trying to reveal the goodness of God to everything and everyone, then enjoying creation, enjoying life, enjoying the gifts that we have, enjoying the people around us, that sounds like a spiritual exercise to me. I mean, this separation of sacred and secular is a very evangelical, modern thing. And not even modern. I mean, medieval Christians got this real wrong as well. Rob Bell was ahead of the curve talking about how everything is spiritual. And I'm sure, Rob Bell, some people love him who are listening and some people hate him, and God bless everyone. That's great. Right. Whatever opinion about Rob Bell you want. This ancient Jewish idea that everything is spiritual, that the Apostle Paul obviously had when he was writing Romans 8, talking about the creation longing for liberation, for the sons and daughters of God to be revealed. Paul had a kind of an idea of an enchanted creation. And that's an idea that I think really we would all do well to sit with and to enjoy, to be present with, and to see that God has left the church building in many ways. Like that's where you start finding God in many ways, is when you venture out into the world that God created.
Yes.
You know what's a really great, beloved of evangelicals resource on this point? I try not to quote C.S. Lewis when I'm in the company of other evangelicals.
Right, right.
way overdone. But maybe for your listeners, the Screw Tape letters are really excellent on this
Yes.
point. Just, how naturally good and beautiful just enjoying the pleasure of nature and life is. Making you get hung up with neuroses about those simple pleasures is maybe the best weapon of the devil. I don't believe in anymore, but like in the book is, a very significant character. There's a lot of truth in that, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up with this huge sacred secular divide, and the good things are spiritual and our enemies are all the things of the world. And so the world is movies that aren't from Pure Flix and music that isn't, heck, we couldn't even listen to CCM how I grew up. So, but being able to hear some of these different perspectives in scripture, and not just in Ecclesiastes, but all throughout, like kind of both of you touched on, I think there is such a sacred spirituality to the physical things in the world.
Yes.
And there's so much to be enjoyed there. And I think I will also leave in the political comment there, because I know we definitely do still have some politically conservative listeners. But the thing that I want them to be able to hear, because I didn't know this growing up, is that there are good Christians on the other side of the aisle.
Yes.
And how you pointed out, we all twist our beliefs around whatever we want them to be. Like, biblical just means you can base it in the Bible. And every cult is biblical in that way. The Crusades were biblical. The conservatives are biblical. The liberals are biblical. We all want to say we have the Bible on our side with it. Yep. So it helps to be able to say, you know what, there's actually a number of Christians out there that believe differently than what you've heard, and that's okay. It's a bigger number than you think.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I was just talking about the Epstein list that came out, I don't know, a month ago or so, something like that. And I mean, truly, truly depraved, immoral, just garbage, I want to use stronger words, but I mean, I have friends who were like, oh, did you see all the times Trump was on that list? And I was like, yeah, but did you also see who else was on that list more than just about anyone? Same as Bill Clinton. And we've got to have some integrity when we talk about these things, no matter what side we're on.
Yeah, Kyle, I want to shoot this one over at you mainly, but Randy, feel free to hop in if you see fit. I'm curious your thoughts on Qoheleth's philosophy, because I've heard a little bit everything. Like, some people thinking he's fatalist, absurdist, hedonist, nihilist. Yeah, it just goes on and on and on. What would you make of someone who says things like everything is absurd? At one point in the book, he says a stillborn child is better than someone who doesn't enjoy life. How would you label his philosophy? And our listeners may not be as familiar with some of the terms as well, so feel free to briefly introduce what you need to.
Yeah, I don't know what the hell he means by the stillborn thing, so I'm not going to touch that.
That is not how you want to invite to a party right there.
No. There is a whole tradition within philosophy. I shouldn't call it a tradition, it's not that old, but there's a branch of philosophy called antinatalism. And there is totally an antinatalist interpretation of that claim, but we're not going to go there right now. That is very depressing stuff. I don't think he's a nihilist, so I'll say that right out the gate. Nihilists don't believe in anything. There's no meaning to anything. Now, the absurdist thing can fit with nihilism, but I don't see Qoheleth going there. So if you were a nihilist, you'd be like the character in The Big Lebowski, right? You just do random stuff because nothing matters, right?
I was wondering if we'd get a reference to that by the end of this.
Yeah. It comes up in every conversation about nihilism. I don't see that in there, because especially if you take the ending of Ecclesiastes to actually, supposed to be there, it's meaningful, wraps things up in some meaningful way. That's definitely not nihilistic. But I don't really see nihilism in the rest of it either, because even if you're finding meaning in just pleasure, the pleasure of life that we were just talking about, that's not nihilism, right?
Yep.
And most of the darkest, most pessimistic existentialist philosophers of the 20th century and the 19th century, they weren't nihilists either. They were trying to cope with a world that they thought was inherently meaningless. But we can create meaning. That's what humans do. And so you don't just resign yourself to that. you do something about it. You do art, or you make music, or you write philosophy, or you fall in love, or whatever. If you experience good whiskey, there's all sorts of things that humans do to cope with that, base senselessness to human suffering and the seemingly inconsequential place of humanity in the universe. So I don't see him as nihilistic. I do see him as doing what a lot of the good existentialist philosophers did, which is recognizing the limits of human thought to do anything about our condition and being really annoyed by it. And it's even worse when you're theistic. Most of the existentialist philosophers weren't. Kierkegaard is a major exception, but for most of them, they're atheists, and so it kind of makes sense. You just got to do what you got to do in the face of ultimate meaninglessness. But for Qoheleth, assuming he actually believes in God as he says, it's worse.
Yep.
It's not better, it's worse, because now you think that God set things up this way. He gave us a brain that can do a lot of really interesting stuff. I think Qoheleth is fascinated with what human ingenuity can accomplish, human intelligence. I think when he talks about wisdom, that's kind of what he has in mind. It's more similar to the Greek notion than it is to, say, the Proverbs notion. But there's a clear limits to it, and it can't get us out of our suffering. So why would God give us a thing and then cap it right before it can do anything about our suffering? That's annoying. and there's not a clear answer. Nature doesn't give you an answer. Revealed scripture doesn't give you an answer. I don't know of an answer, and I don't think Qoheleth did either. So I see him as very much in line with some of the existentialist thinkers, maybe even Kierkegaard a little bit too, in just kind of airing, honestly, questions about that. Why did you do it this way, God? And ultimately, there aren't any answers at the end of the book. You just have to fear the being that did it and get on with your life. I don't like that, but I find it very honest and refreshing. So, yeah, that's my short take on what he's up to there. It fits into a long tradition of philosophers trying to make sense of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Good. Wouldn't you say Qoheleth is kind of a classic ancient materialist, Kyle?
That's a good question. Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I'm assuming you mean materialist in the sense that the physical world is what there is, not in the sense that we're trying to get all the possessions.
Right.
Yeah. Because he's ultimately an anti-materialist in the possession sense, right? I did all the stuff and it wasn't meaningful. Yeah, maybe, because there's not a lot of room in there for an afterlife to fix things.
Right.
I don't know if it's clear that he believes in an afterlife. And I jab at that heavily. I'm an agnostic about an afterlife, but if there is one, no matter how good it is, it ain't going to fix what happened here. I feel that strongly. So I see that in there too.
That's an interesting angle, because I do think it's pretty clear he is a theist, but I also think you can make a good case that he doesn't see any kind of eternity. And one of the most interesting things I found in my study so far is when he says under the sun. Like, I had heard preachers say, oh, well, that means he's removing God from the picture. This is a life without God. This is how miserable you are without God. But then I came across a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh that says, only the gods live forever under the sun. So from that mindset, even the gods existed under the sun. So he wasn't removing God from the picture. He was saying everything that exists is still this absurd vapor, even with God in the picture. So, yeah, it's really nuanced book.
Of Gilgamesh. I was not expecting that tonight.
Our listeners will know that pops up pretty frequently in our podcast.
Well done, sir.
Thank you. I want to get at least one more in here if I can, and that is at 9:30 at night here on a Thursday. Let's just hit the question: meaning of life. Because we can do this in the last 5 minutes we have, right?
Absolutely. Kyle can.
Qoheleth really seems to get into this idea of, for him, life is, I don't know if I would say the meaning of life. Feel free to say if you think this is his take on it or not. But he says basically eat, drink, enjoy some time with friends, and get the most you can out of your work. Would you agree with that as essentially the meaning of life or our purpose as humans, or would you disagree with him? Like, here we go. What is the meaning of life, Kyle and Randy?
That's funny. I have a friend who's writing a dissertation on that right now. Maybe I'll ask him later. And the question always struck me as confused in some way, and I'm sure he would correct me about that. But there obviously isn't a meaning, right? None that humans could know anyway, and I don't think it matters if you're a theist or not. So at the very least, there have to be meanings, multiple. I think that meaning even just lexically, it's a word that only has a sense in the context of what humans do in community. I don't know what meaning would mean apart from humans creating meaning together through various activities in groups. If there were no humans, as far as I can tell, there wouldn't be any such thing as meaning or meaningfulness. And then, of course, we import that into our theologizing. I say, of course, like that's obvious. It's an extremely controversial claim that I just made, but I think it's true. So I don't know what it means to ask what the meaning of life is. So just put that out there. I don't think there can be just one. That said, I've always been struck by how consistent the picture of a good life is across human history, across intellectual traditions that never had any contact with one another.
And so different religions and spiritualities.
Different religions, completely different frameworks, assumptions. So I always pointed this out when I taught ethics. When we read Confucius, I would pair it with Aristotle, two thinkers who were writing in very different contexts, never had any interaction, any reason to come to the same conclusions necessarily. And yet their picture of the good life is very similar. And at one point, Confucius said something along the lines of, like, what is a good day? And a good day is essentially going fishing and goofing off with your friends, more or less.
Yeah.
And that's like what all human life is aimed at. All human activity is aimed at that thing that we don't have a better word for than happiness. And everybody knows what it is. It's a little bit different for everybody, right? But that doesn't mean it's a fundamentally different idea. The ideal is the same for everybody. We all know what a good human life looks like. And if we had to imagine an ideal day, everybody's would be more similar than different. And so if there is an answer to a weird question, like what is the meaning of life, it has to have something to do, as far as I can tell, with that thing that we all know intuitively makes us happy, or is an example of a flourishing life, a life done well. And so the question then becomes, how do we maximize that? How do we, make it so that the most people can have the most of that? And that's just where ethics starts. So to ask, what is the meaning of life, to me is really just asking, what does it mean to be good? And that we can riff about for a long time. Yeah. That's a whole different conversation. But yeah, I think it means to be virtuous. And that's an ancient answer, really boring answer to a question that seems interesting until you answer it that way. But
now,
I agree with Aristotle. It means to be good.
And let me press that for a second for some of our listeners. In virtuous, do you mean doing a good thing or getting to the good life in that way? Like,
they're not
virtue isn't necessary. Okay.
They're not different. Okay. They're different in this sense. Doing a good thing does not make one good. It's a life of doing good things. It's a habit of turning yourself into a certain kind of person who can have the most experiences like the one that Confucius describes, and who can make it so that the most other people can have those kinds of experiences as often as possible and as fully as possible. So yeah, there's no difference between those two things ultimately.
That is very much in the vein of Aristotle. That was what was it? A Nicomachean ethics, I think, was the general idea he gave to that.
So I went through grad school. They teach you to tear down arguments. And you can get so into that sometimes it's impossible to look at one that has lasted for thousands of years and just say, that's probably right. And it was a thing I had to learn after years of doing the opposite. Is it's okay to sometimes recognize when an ancient thinker got a thing right, and now we're building on it. And so there's been a huge resurgence in Aristotelian ethics since then. We're trying to reject a whole bunch of what he said because he got a lot very obviously wrong, some seriously problematic things in there. But this basic thing, we should focus ethics on what a good life is like. I think he's probably right about that.
Good. I like it. Randy?
Hopefully it'll take less than the 10 minutes that Kyle did. Jeez.
Oh, good.
No, I think to the original question of like, did Qoheleth get the meaning of life right or wrong? I think it's yes and no. I think there is a lot to be said about, if you want to have a meaningful life today, just enjoy it. Enjoy this day. Do all the things that I've been talking about this whole time. That I think is a secret that many, many of us miss, especially in our kind of like objective-based, goal-oriented culture that we live in. I just know plenty of people who are so consumed with whether you're a pastor and you're consumed with getting that next 100 people or 1,000 people or whatever to your, adding a service or adding, another line item on your budget. That's what makes life meaningful for you in that moment. And you're obsessing about it so much to the fact that like you're missing most dinners with your family every single week because you're obsessed with building your own empire. You can take a pastor out of that and put corporate anything on there, or you can put philosopher, academic on there. When I think of what's the meaning of life, one of the things I think of is like, how many times have we heard people on their deathbed say like, didn't wish I attended another meeting. I didn't wish I another zero on the end of my salary. I just wish I was loved by and loved people more and better. And I want to be with people. And so I do think being present today is a huge part of finding meaning in life. Life gets really fleeting and heavy and vain and absurd and meaningless and vapor. Like if you kind of are shooting for something that's always just outside of your grasp, we get obsessed with living in that fashion. And I think that's a meaningless life. Truly, I do. And then I just like to get a little biblical. I mean, human beings are created in the image of God. And if you fast forward through the biblical narrative almost to the end, the Apostle John then says in 1 John that God is love. And so I think that living a meaningful life looks like living a life of love. If we model ourselves at all after the person of Christ, which if we're Christians, we should be, you find a life well lived, that Jesus can say something to the effect of like, look, dude, if you want to follow me, that's great. But like, I'm homeless. I don't have a home. I'm wandering around the countryside. This is the life I'm living. A life of self-sacrificial love, being loved in return. To me, I don't know of anything richer or more meaningful than pursuing a life of love, whether it's in my workplace, my family, with my friggin' dog, with nature outside by myself, loving the air, the oxygen that I'm breathing and the feeling of it filling my lungs. And, I mean, fishing is a good example, Kyle. I don't remember which philosopher you said that, but that's a meaningful day. Being present in those things and loving the setting that you're in and loving the gift of life that is this moment. I think if I get to the end of my days and people, or like at my funeral, I don't need people to go on and on about what a great pastor Randy was or how these messages unlocked so much meaning in my life, like praise the Lord if that's the case, but that won't turn my crank. If I get a bunch of people at the end of my life saying, I felt really loved and seen and known by Randy, or I felt like Randy really loved my companionship, my friendship. Those are the things that I'd love for people to be able to say about me. That would make my life meaningful. If my kids have stories to tell to their kids after I'm gone about their dad and the way that he played catch with them and all that stuff, that's what I want to orient my life around. Others in love and receiving love and living fully today. That's it.
Wow. I feel like we need an altar call after that. No, that's great. And I think that's something that is so challenging. At least, well, I'll just speak for myself and say that is very challenging for me to do. I kind of resonate with Qoheleth of being this like, oh, I want to try the best that there is out there. Like there's 10 minutes down the road from my house, one of the best burgers I've ever had in my life. And yet I will still try to find some new place that I've never had before and be like, oh, but maybe it's better. And you miss out on the darn good burger that's right there in your town, in your backyard. And there's just so many ways I find myself doing that. Like I'm looking for the next thing. And I think we all do that, whether it's getting the promotion or getting in a relationship or fill in the blank with whatever it is for you. But the longer you do that, you're never going to reach it. And then you just look back and you see how much of life you missed. Like we can boil all of this down to enjoy the moment and get everything out of it you can.
Yep.
thank you both for your time here on this. It has been wonderful hearing from both of your perspectives on this. I think you have brought so much into this, and I know we could keep going on for hours and hours, but anything else that you guys want to share in the last minute or two here? Feel free to rep your podcast and any socials you have, anything like that.
I'll just say, to the point you were just making, we just recently interviewed a philosopher named Aaron Simmons, who wrote a book called Camping with Kierkegaard, and it's all about that. So people should check that out.
I agree.
It's very accessible.
And I'll just jump in. We have a resource page on our website. I already have that up on there because I thought it was one of your best episodes, and I loved it. So that's already up there, and I'll link to it in this one as well. Thanks for bringing that up, Kyle.
Super relevant. Yeah, if you want to find us, we're on any social media app, any podcast app, the Pastor and Philosopher Walk into the Bar. Social media is at PPWB Podcast. We recently got on TikTok, if any of your listeners are under 20 years old. So it makes me feel ancient, but we're on there. So yeah, find us wherever. Yeah,
I'm largely responsible for our social media, which means our social media sucks. So pay attention to TikTok and not Twitter and Facebook, because Kyle's in charge of TikTok and it's way better already than anything else that I'm doing. But yeah, we'd love it if you guys just checked us out. If you love us, leave a review. If you hate us, leave a review too. We love all the responses. But thanks for having us, Colin. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely.
Stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible.
Love it. Thank you both. Really appreciate having you on.
Thanks, Colin.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.